In 1949, after 4 centuries of control, Holland surrendered its colonies in Southeast Asia. 200 cultures, spread across 13,000 islands, which had comprised the Dutch East Indies, now became Indonesia. Today, Indonesia has the 5th largest population in the world. On December 7, 1975, the Indonesian military invaded East Timor, which had been a Portuguese colony for 400 years.
They fired from air, from sea, from earth, bombs from warships near Atauru, from ship to foot. They fired bombs on Dili and his outskirts in order to kill everything, everyone they find. Oh, that was a massacre. So it was really. It begins with a massacre, slaughter.
The mountainous island of Timor lies 600 kilometers north of Australia. West Timor, a former Dutch colony, was annexed by Indonesia in 1949. After a brief civil war between the 2 nationalist parties, the Democratic Republic of East Timor was proclaimed. The governing party, the Revolutionary Front for an Independent East Timor, Fretilin, sought peaceful relations with Indonesia. The Indonesian government, wary of separatist movements in its territories, felt threatened by the example of a small independent nation on its doorstep. The ensuing invasion has claimed over 200,000 Timorese lives and continues to this day.
The U.S. and Canada, and in fact the West generally, has ignored the situation in East Timor in part. It hasn't ignored it totally. So, for example, the United States, England, and other countries have been very pleased to send arms to Indonesia. It's profitable and it helps them consummate the massacre. They've been interested in this sense. But the actual ongoing slaughter itself has been of no concern to the West, except that they want it to be consummated efficiently and effectively, and they would like to see East Timor integrated into Indonesia. Why this attitude towards a slaughter, one of the major slaughters of the modern period, in fact, relative to size, probably the major slaughter since the Second World War? Well, the answer to that question goes back to the, it leads us to broader geopolitical considerations and historical considerations. We have to really go back to the end of the Second World War. After the Second World War, as the United States was essentially organizing a world system that it intended to dominate and assigning each area its proper role, Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, was, you look at the secret documents now declassified, you find that Southeast Asia was assigned a specific function. It was to fulfill its function, as the State Department put it. It was to fulfill its function as a source of raw materials and resources for the industrial West.
Canada is involved in Indonesia because it's a particularly good place to go if you want no unions to worry about, workers who are treated very badly, workers whom you don't have to pay a great deal of money to, and an army to back up a no-strike situation. What happened in 1965 was that there was a right-wing coup which was headed by General Suharto, who has ever since been the president of Indonesia. In the aftermath of the coup, at least, according to CIA statistics, 700,000 people were killed. And the estimate actually goes above 1 million if you go to Amnesty International. In the aftermath of that, naturally the population was terrorized, all the effective unions were smashed, and it became a perfect investment climate for countries like Canada.
I would like to draw honourable members' attention to the presence in the gallery today of His Excellency Dr. Mokhtar Kussumadamaja, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia. Honourable Member for Eglinton Lawrence.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State for External Affairs knows that Canada has allotted $300 million in aid through CETA to Indonesia over a 5-year period. And in fact, that represents the 4th largest Canadian program of aid in all of Asia. How can this government continue to ignore the fact that Indonesia has invaded East Timor with 40,000 troops and is conducting Operation Extinction, which is tantamount to genocide? What kind of representations will this Secretary of State of Canada for Foreign Affairs make to the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Dr. Mokhtar, who is in fact right here in Ottawa at the present time?
Mr. Speaker, I trust that the Right Honourable Leader of the Opposition is embarrassed by this kind of grandstanding.
Hear, hear.
He says
no.
He says he isn't, Mr. Speaker, which speaks volumes of his judgment.
Hear, hear.
The honourable member is considerably out of date with his accusations with regard to East Timor. I have in fact discussed the matter with Dr. Mokhtar during my visit to Indonesia in 1985. At our suggestion, the Canadian ambassador in Indonesia was invited to visit East Timor to see conditions for himself. He believes that the arguments that have been made by various groups are exaggerated. I'm sure that I speak for the government of Indonesia in indicating that they would be prepared to welcome. That they would be prepared to welcome the honourable member to come and see for himself. That would be a change in the basis of his representations in this House if they were based on fact.
What in fact happened, just the essence of it, is that in 1975 the Indonesian government attacked the neighboring island of Timor, East Timor, which had been a Portuguese colony. They had never laid any claim to it. They had no claim to it, nor did any international, is there any basis in international law or elsewhere for such a claim. In the course of this attack, which has now been going on for 12 years, in the first stages of it, there was in fact a very large-scale massacre. By 1977, the Indonesian army had actually run out of arms, depleted its arms supplies in the course of this aggression. The Carter administration at that point took a little time off from its passionate rhetoric about its concern for human rights so as to significantly escalate the arms flow to Indonesia to enable it to consummate the slaughter. The major massacres, in which perhaps several 100,000 people were killed out of a population of 700,000 initially, they took place after the Carter administration increased the arms flow to Indonesia with the conscious knowledge that this would be the consequence. That's when the remnants of the population which had fled to the hills were driven down to Indonesian-run concentration camps and so on. Meanwhile, Canada was also, the Canadian media, for example, were totally silent about all of this. The Canadian government has simply officially endorsed the most ludicrous Indonesian propaganda about the Timorese requesting Indonesia to intervene, to annex them to Indonesia, and so on. And meanwhile, of course, Canadian corporations are enriching themselves by, not in Timor, which is too small to be of interest to them, but in Indonesia, where Canada is the major Western investor and therefore extremely supportive of Indonesian atrocities, aggression, and brutality.
You kill a lot of them recently?
Oh, no. We never kill him because they are our family, like the other family in the other part of Indonesia. All of the people right here is our family, so we do not kill him. Of course not.
Brutal murders by Indonesian troops have silenced many voices of opposition. Fearing for the safety of relatives still in East Timor, refugees can only speak out under conditions of anonymity.
I have been beaten too, and my friends, some of my friends have been, they have been put them into the tank full of water, and then they forced these friends to be under the water as long as they want. And when these friends resist under the water, they try to come up to come up of the water to breathe, and then they hit with the butt of the gun, or they beat them with rods, and after that they burn these friends with cigarettes.
The people of East Timor are inhabitants of the island for thousands of years. Before the invasion in 1975, there were about 700,000 people, most of which were Melanesian, dark skin, much more related to the people of Papua New Guinea and other peoples of South Pacific region than to the Polynesian people, Malaysian people of Indonesia and the rest of Asia. The people of East Timor used to live in the mountain region. About 90% were subsistence farmers who tend their land for centuries. And they lived peacefully. There was never starvation or shortage of food because majority of the population were subsistence farmers. East Timor is potentially very rich in agriculture. It produced rice, corn, peanuts, and every kind of tropical fruit. And the coastal area is extremely rich in fish. There is a lot of wildlife in the country, which people can live on.
Well, people often ask the question why we should care about a tiny, isolated, remote place such as East Timor, which they've never heard about. And it's, in a way, a curious kind of question. I mean, there's a more general question, namely, why should we care about being involved in genocide or mass slaughter? Why should Germans care about the slaughter of the Jews? Why should Russians care about the massacre of Afghans? Why should we care about the people of East Timor? It's essentially the same question. The facts of the matter are that we are engaged, our governments are engaged, and to the extent that we think we're responsible for the actions of our governments, we're engaged in a large-scale mass slaughter, to which the word genocide is not inappropriate, in East Timor, and we have been so since 1975. So if we're concerned about our bloody hands, then we should be concerned about East Timor. If, on the other hand, we think that the slaughter of people who get in our way is perfectly fine, not a problem, that our main goals are to enrich ourselves and crush anyone who happens to be in our path, then, of course, there's no reason at all for us to be concerned about East Timor except to applaud the successes of the United States and Canada and other countries in facilitating and providing the requisite diplomatic and military support for the Indonesian attack.
Canada doesn't have a lot of involvement in East Timor per se, but what is really important is Canada's involvement in Indonesia, which is the attacking nation. Canada has at least $1.4 billion invested in Indonesia, which makes it really unique. Canada is the largest Western investor there, just behind Japan and Hong Kong, and even ahead of the United States. We have more money, in fact, invested in Indonesia than we have anywhere else in the world except for the United States and Great Britain, which again is very strange. It's the one third world nation where we have real economic clout. Not only do we have really powerful investment there, which is mostly in the form of an Inco plant out in the jungle in Sulawesi, but we also have a trade surplus. Again, it's unique in the Pacific Rim. And we have a very big aid program, which is the largest non-Commonwealth program in the world. Canada has always made quite a lot of money off selling arms to kill Asians with. I mean, one of the little-known facts, I suppose, of Canada's military record is that the Vietnam War was a great boon to our military producers. We sold something like $2 billion worth of armaments to the Americans to kill the Vietnamese and other Indo-Chinese with. That, catapulted us right into the top 10 of world military producers. And in fact, every single university in Canada made money off contracts to the American Armed Forces during that war. Now, we've sort of continued in that tradition ever since. It's important to remember that when the Vietnamese War shut down in 1975, the one in East Timor started up. And ever since then, we've been giving arms to the Indonesians to carry on that war with. This is, in fact, a copy of the Canadian Defence Products Guide. It's paid for by our tax money, and it goes out to people like the Indonesians so that they can see what they can buy, again, to kill people whose countries they are invading. We don't always know about which weapons are being sold because the Canadian government doesn't always admit to them being for military use. And in fact, it's not there's no public documentation which is readily available to find out what we're selling. But one of the biggest single sales that we know about recently was in February 1987. 100 engines, which are twin turbocraft engines, the number is PT-63B, were sold. They are made by Pratt & Whitney in Montreal, and they're for use in Bell 412 helicopters. They were flown to Bandung in Indonesia. They were assembled on an Air Force base. And from there, we assume they're going to be used in East Timor. Because they're slow-moving counterinsurgency aircraft, they're very good for use in a war against guerrillas.
Is the minister saying, Mr. Speaker, that he has received from the Foreign Minister of Indonesia and from our ambassador in Indonesia and other sources sufficient evidence that the military occupation of East Timor has come to an end and that the massive human rights violations have also come to an end?
In a word, Mr. Speaker, yes.
The Honourable Member for New Westminster, Coquitlam.
Mr. Speaker, that is not the evidence, as the Minister knows, that we have received from Amnesty International, which is a body that we usually rely upon. And particularly, if I may ask specifically, in my second question, about Canadian arms exports to Indonesia, which have been going on during the period of the military occupation of East Timor, and indeed to the tune of $2 million worth of military goods. Next month, the High-Tech 87 is encouraging further military exports to Indonesia. Will the Minister seriously look at the continuation of such exports in light of the reports that we have received from very reliable sources?
Mr. Speaker, I know the honourable member takes these matters seriously and would not want to engage in representations that would be misleading. She made reference to the export of military equipment. The military equipment in question is not arms. She made reference to the question of massive violations of human rights and asked if I was satisfied that those were not occurring. I am satisfied that there are not massive violations of human rights. There was very legitimate room for concern for a period of time with regard to the situation in East Timor. It is our information that that cause for concern has diminished considerably in recent years, and I would welcome the member to acquaint herself with the current facts in East Timor.
Now, what happened at the United Nations was that there were a number of votes which denounced the invasion and called for immediate withdrawal of Indonesian troops and recognition of the right of East Timor not to be molested. Now, what happened each time was that Canada abstained until 1979, when it started voting along with Indonesia to say that it was a fait accompli, there was really nothing wrong with the occupation, and that it was time to go on with what they called reconstruction. And this has been the line ever since of the Canadian government, that things are basically okay. There was a bad period at the beginning when there might have been a few little human rights violations and a few people killed, but basically things were fine. Now, this is a flat-out lie. The thing is that there has been a war going on ever since then. I mean, it's been 12 years now. It doesn't show any signs of stopping. Fretilin, the resistance is as strong as it ever was. But yet the Canadian government refuses to admit that, because to admit that would be to say that there is still a war going on, which is something that's insupportable.
Fretilin was created officially after the coup in Portugal in 1974, when the new regime in Portugal liberalized political life, allowing political activities to take place. Our goal was essentially to establish an independent East Timor. Never at one time in our political platform we inscribe any label, any ideological label to ourselves. We were simply a nationalist front, and we believed in improving the quality of life of the Timorese people. We start with by organizing literacy programs throughout the country, because in a country with more than 90% illiterate, in order to be able to mobilize the people, to raise their political awareness, we had to give them some basic tools to understand what we wanted to do with an independent East Timor. So we mobilized Timorese students from high school and the technical schools to go to the countryside and set up literacy schools on the basis of the Paul Freire method. We also set up cooperative schemes throughout the country. We brought to many villages in the remote interior water projects, some housing projects, healthcare that they never had before. We believe that through these concrete projects we would win the allegiance, the support of the people, because we were not simply propagating empty ideas, but we are in fact working with them to bring solutions to their concrete problems. The Indonesians, they use massive firepower to try to crush Fretilin.
What areas of East Timor are they controlling now?
Oh, no, they do not control at all, just 200 and disorganized. They have no organization at all, so of course they do not control. You can go everywhere.
How can you explain all these Indonesian forces in East Timor just for 200 people?
We just waiting him in the villages to get them return home. We just only ask him to come to us. We send their family to come to us, and finally they come to us.
In the period of 77-79, because of massive Indonesian invasion, offensive, with the increase in military supplies from the Western Wall, Indonesia basically almost defeated Fretilin militarily. But after a period of reorganization, Fretilin was able to emerge again by 1981. In 1982, Fretilin was able to relaunch its own military operations against the Indonesians. By 1983, Fretilin forced the Indonesians to come to the negotiation table. General Purwanto, the Indonesian military commander in East Timor, under instructions from the Indonesian Armed Forces Chief, General Benny Murdani, sought talks with Fretilin. And why did they seek talks with Fretilin? Because the Indonesian army was unable, realized that it was unable to defeat Fretilin militarily. So by 1983 onwards, Fretilin increased in its organizational capabilities. It had captured a big amount of weapons and was able to deploy in the field up to 200, 400 men in engagements with the Indonesians.
today threatening has about 3,000 troops. They are fighting because their land has been taken away from them. They have been pushed away from the ancestral sacred lands in the mountains where they lived for thousands of years. And as long as this situation remains, and as long as foreigners occupy their land, be they Indonesians or whoever, they will continue to fight.
There are an estimated 60,000 Timorese living in the mountains free of Indonesian occupation. The Indonesians have cut off information about the resistance movement to the outside world. Letters and images such as these recent photos are occasionally smuggled out, proof of the guerrillas' continued resistance and strength. Diplomatically, Fretilin and the Union for a Democratic Timor, UDT, have formed a political coalition. Together, they are counting on international pressure to force the Indonesian military to withdraw from their country.
The United States, Canada, and so on have no particular interest in seeing the Timorese slaughtered. They simply don't care. What they care about is ensuring that Indonesia continues to fulfill its function as a source of resources, raw materials, opportunities for investment, markets, enabling in the first place, assisting in the recovery of Japan, now enriching the West. It's essentially, as far as Canada is concerned, it's essentially the same as Indochina. Canada had no particular interest in seeing several million people slaughtered in Indochina, but it did have an interest in profit, and therefore Canada became the largest per capita war exporter in the world during the Indochina War, enriching itself on the destruction of Indochina, while of course providing appropriate hypocritical moralizing about the evil of the American bombers and so on and so forth. That's standard and typical, and the East Timor situation is simply one case in point. So the silence of the West concerning East Timor is completely understandable. The reality is unpleasant, and therefore it's better not to know about it. And the ideological institutions perform their task very effectively. They keep us from knowing about it.
It's difficult to think of a world situation in which Canadian activism would have more punch than the Indonesian East Timor situation. Indonesia is extremely sensitive to world opinion, and particularly Canadian opinion. And this is a case where even the most simple letter writing, if that's all that people choose to do, would have a very powerful effect. People could write to their MPs, to the government, to CETA to criticize aid programs which are badly being used. They can criticize military production. They can write to the Indonesian government itself. All these things would be quite powerful, and they're very easy to do. There are other things that they can do. People can, either individually or through groups they're already involved in, educate their local neighborhoods about East Timor and try to get other forms of activism started up. There is, in fact, a wide range of things that they could do, right up to nonviolent civil disobedience, for example, to possibly blockade the sale of military products to Indonesia, which is, I think, quite important because that's going up as well.